Imagine stepping through a shimmering portal, leaving behind the comforts of your modern life. Suddenly, the air crackles with the scent of incense and something else, something akin to raw sewage. The sounds of bustling markets and distant battle drums fill your ears. Can you picture yourself navigating the intricate social hierarchy, the brutal legal system, the constant threat of famine, and the ever-present shadow of war that defined ancient China? Could you truly survive? Probably not. Ancient China, a land of breathtaking beauty and profound wisdom, was also a realm of unimaginable hardship for the vast majority of its inhabitants. This wasn't a place for the faint of heart. Forget your air conditioning, your antibiotics, and your readily available avocado toast. Life in the Middle Kingdom was a constant struggle against the elements, against injustice, and often against each other. Let's start with the very foundation of ancient Chinese society, the social hierarchy. You might think you're relatively successful in your current life, perhaps holding a decent job, owning a car, maybe even a house. But in ancient China, your fate was largely determined by birth. Forget climbing the corporate ladder. The social ladder was practically a greased pole covered in thorns. At the very top, of course, reigned the emperor. Divinely appointed, he held absolute power, his word law, his whims, often dictating the lives of millions. Below him were the scholar officials, the mandarins, who formed the bureaucratic backbone of the empire. These men, rigorously educated in Confucian classics, poetry, and calligraphy, were the gatekeepers of power, influencing policy and controlling the vast administrative apparatus. To even aspire to their ranks required years, decades even, of dedicated study and the passing of grueling imperial examinations. Imagine spending your entire youth memorizing the Analects, not because you wanted to, but because your very survival depended on it. Beneath the scholar officials came a diverse, yet often precarious middle class. Merchants, artisans, and landowners eked out a living, contributing to the economy but often viewed with suspicion by the ruling elite. Merchants, despite their wealth, were considered low in status, their pursuit of profit deemed less virtuous than the pursuit of knowledge or the tilling of the land. Artisans, skilled in crafting everything from exquisite porcelain to sturdy farming tools, enjoyed a slightly higher standing, but their livelihoods were still vulnerable to economic downturns and the whims of wealthy patrons. Landowners, particularly those with substantial holdings, held a degree of power and influence in their local communities, but they were also targets for ambitious officials and land-hungry neighbors. And then, the vast majority, the peasants. These were the backbone of the empire, the farmers who toiled from dawn till dusk, planting and harvesting the rice, wheat, and millet that fed the nation. Their lives were a relentless cycle of backbreaking labor, punctuated by the ever-present threat of famine, floods, and exorbitant taxes. Would you like me to narrate another script for you? Imagine waking before sunrise, your muscles already aching, knowing that you'll spend the next 12 hours bent double in a paddy field, battling insects, heat, and the constant fear of crop failure. A bad harvest could mean starvation for your family. A corrupt official could seize your land. A sudden war could sweep through your village, leaving devastation in its wake. Now, where would you fit into this hierarchy? Let's be honest. Unless you possess a photographic memory and an unwavering dedication to Confucian ideals, the chances of becoming a scholar official are slim to none. Perhaps you fancy yourself a shrewd businessman? Prepare to be looked down upon. An artisan with a knack for pottery? You'll be forever reliant on the patronage of the wealthy. Most likely, you'd end up as one of the countless peasants, struggling to survive in a world that offers little in the way of comfort or opportunity. And that's before we even consider the legal system. The legal system of ancient China was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly known for its leniency. Forget your Miranda rights, your presumption of innocence, and your right to a fair trial. In ancient China, the law was often a blunt instrument, wielded by the state to maintain order and punish transgressions with swift and often brutal efficiency. The concept of rule of law, as we understand it today, was largely absent. Instead, the emphasis was on maintaining social harmony and upholding the authority of the emperor and his officials. Laws were often vague and open to interpretation, leaving considerable discretion in the hands of local magistrates. This could lead to arbitrary judgments and the potential for abuse of power. If a local official didn't like the look of you, or if you happened to offend someone with influence, you could find yourself facing charges based on little more than suspicion or hearsay. Punishments were harsh, ranging from fines and forced labor to imprisonment, flogging, banishment, and, of course, execution. And we're not talking about a humane, lethal injection. We're talking about beheading, strangulation, dismemberment, and even death by 1,000 cuts, a particularly gruesome form of torture reserved for the most heinous crimes, such as treason. Imagine being accused of a crime you didn't commit, knowing that the evidence against you is flimsy, but that the consequences could be fatal. Torture was a common method of extracting confessions. Officials believed that the truth could be forced out of even the most hardened criminals through the application of pain. Bamboo slivers under the fingernails, waterboarding, yes, it's been around for centuries, beatings with bamboo canes. These were all standard tools in the arsenal of the ancient Chinese interrogator. Even if you were innocent, the pressure to confess under such duress would be immense. How long could you withstand the pain before breaking down and admitting to something you didn't do just to make it stop? The severity of the punishment often depended on the social status of both the victim and the perpetrator. If you were a peasant who dared to offend a member of the gentry, you could expect little mercy. Conversely, if you were a wealthy landowner who committed a crime against a peasant, you might be able to use your influence to escape punishment, or at least mitigate the severity of the sentence. Justice, it seemed, was not always blind. Even seemingly minor offenses could carry surprisingly harsh penalties. Disrespecting your elders, for example, was considered a serious crime, punishable by flogging or even imprisonment. Failing to pay your taxes on time could result in the seizure of your property and the imprisonment of your family. Engaging in gambling or other immoral activities could lead to public shaming and social ostracism. Furthermore, the concept of collective responsibility was often applied. If one member of a family committed a crime, the entire family could be held accountable. This meant that even if you were innocent, you could still suffer the consequences of someone else's actions. Imagine your brother stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving children, and you being thrown in jail alongside him. And let's not forget the ever-present threat of bandits and rebels. In times of famine or political unrest, banditry was rampant. Desperate men, driven to the brink by hunger and poverty, would often resort to raiding villages and attacking travelers. If you were unlucky enough to cross their path, you could be robbed, beaten, or even killed. Rebel groups, often fueled by resentment towards the ruling dynasty, would sometimes launch uprisings, plunging entire regions into chaos and violence. Getting caught in the middle of such conflicts was a sure way to meet an untimely end. So imagine you're accused of stealing from a wealthy merchant. You're dragged before a magistrate who is known for his corruption and his fondness for harsh punishments. You're innocent, but the merchant has influence, and the magistrate seems inclined to believe his version of events. You're subjected to torture, and after days of agonizing pain, you finally confess to a crime you didn't commit. You're sentenced to banishment, forced to leave your family and everything you know behind, to wander the countryside as a pariah, constantly at risk of starvation and attack. That's just one possible scenario in the brutal reality of the ancient Chinese legal system. Beyond the legal system and the social hierarchy, another constant threat loomed large: famine. Ancient China was a land of dramatic agricultural cycles, subject to devastating droughts, floods, and insect plagues. A single bad harvest could spell disaster for millions of people. The staple crops of ancient China, rice, wheat, and millet, were highly susceptible to weather conditions. Too much rain could lead to floods, destroying crops and spreading disease. Too little rain could lead to droughts, withering the fields and leaving the land barren. Locust swarms could descend upon the countryside, devouring entire harvests in a matter of days. The lack of advanced agricultural technology and infrastructure exacerbated the problem. Irrigation systems were often rudimentary, and the transportation of food from surplus regions to areas in need was slow and inefficient. This meant that even if some parts of the country had a good harvest, other regions could still be facing starvation. During times of famine, people would resort to desperate measures to survive. They would eat bark, roots, and even dirt to stave off hunger. They would sell their possessions, their land, and even their children to buy food. Crime would become rampant. As people turned to theft and violence to survive, the government would often attempt to provide relief to famine-stricken areas, but these efforts were often inadequate or hampered by corruption. Officials would divert food supplies for their own benefit or sell them on the black market for exorbitant prices. This meant that the people who needed help the most were often left to fend for themselves. Famine was not just a matter of hunger. It also led to disease. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, making people more vulnerable to infectious diseases like cholera, typhus, and dysentery. These diseases could spread rapidly through crowded and unsanitary conditions, decimating entire populations. Imagine you're a peasant farmer, and your crops have failed due to a prolonged drought. Your family is starving, and you have nothing left to sell. You watch as your children grow weaker and weaker each day. You hear stories of people resorting to cannibalism in neighboring villages. Desperate, you consider abandoning your home and joining the throngs of refugees who are fleeing to the cities in search of food. But you know that the cities are already overcrowded and disease-ridden, and that your chances of survival there are slim. What do? And then there was war. Ancient China was a land of constant conflict, both internal and external. Dynasties rose and fell, emperors battled for power, and nomadic tribes from the north and west constantly threatened the borders of the empire. The constant warfare placed a tremendous strain on the resources of the empire. Armies had to be fed, equipped, and supplied, which meant higher taxes for the peasants and less resources available for public works. Conscription was a common practice, and young men were often forced to leave their families and fight in distant lands, with little chance of returning home. Warfare was brutal and unforgiving. Battles were fought with swords, spears, and bows and arrows, and casualties were often high. Sieges could last for months, even years, with both sides suffering heavy losses from starvation and disease. Civilians were often caught in the crossfire, and villages were looted and burned. Even during times of peace, the threat of war was ever present. The empire had to maintain a large standing army to defend its borders and suppress internal rebellions. This meant that young men were constantly being trained for war, and that the economy was always geared towards military production. Imagine you're a young man living in a border region. You're drafted into the army and sent to fight against a nomadic tribe that is raiding your homeland. You're given a sword and a shield and told to defend your country. You're scared, but you know that you have no choice. If you refuse to fight, you'll be branded a traitor and punished severely. You fight bravely, but you're outnumbered and outmatched. You see your friends and comrades falling around you, and you know that your own death is likely imminent. In short, ancient China was a tough place to live. The social hierarchy, the brutal legal system, the constant threat of famine, and the ever-present shadow of war made life a constant struggle for survival. Unless you were born into privilege or possessed exceptional skills and unwavering ambition, your chances of living a long and prosperous life were slim. It was a world of beauty and wisdom, yes, but also a world of hardship and suffering. A world where survival was not guaranteed, and where even the smallest mistake could have fatal consequences. So, do you still think you could survive? Let's delve a little deeper into some specific scenarios and aspects of daily life that would likely prove challenging for our hypothetical time traveler, you. We've touched on the big picture: the social hierarchy, the legal system, famine, and war. But it's the smaller, more intimate details that often truly reveal the chasm between our modern sensibilities and the realities of the past. Let's consider hygiene, for instance. We take clean water and sanitation for granted. We shower daily, brush our teeth, and have access to modern plumbing. In ancient China, however, hygiene was a much more rustic affair. Clean water was a precious commodity, particularly in urban areas. Rivers and wells were often contaminated with sewage and industrial waste. Boiling water was a common practice, but fuel was not always readily available, especially for the poor. Bathing was not a daily ritual for most people. While the wealthy could afford to have servants draw water and heat it for them, the vast majority of the population relied on public bathhouses or simply washed in rivers and streams. Dental hygiene was even more rudimentary. Toothbrushes existed, but they were often made from animal bristles, which could harbor bacteria. Toothpaste was unknown, and people typically used salt or herbal powders to clean their teeth. Cavities and gum disease were rampant, and toothaches were a common ailment. Imagine dealing with a throbbing toothache for weeks, with no access to a dentist or pain medication. Sanitation was also a major problem. Sewage disposal systems were primitive, and human waste was often dumped into rivers or used as fertilizer. This created a breeding ground for disease-carrying insects and parasites. The smell in many cities, particularly during the hot summer months, must have been truly unbearable. Clothing, too, presented its own set of challenges. The vast majority of the population wore simple garments made from coarse materials like hemp or cotton. These clothes were often uncomfortable, itchy, and difficult to clean. The wealthy, of course, could afford silk garments, which were softer and more luxurious, but also expensive and delicate. Laundry was a laborious process, involving washing clothes by hand in rivers or streams, beating them with rocks to remove dirt, and then drying them in the sun. Soap was not widely available, and people often used lye or other harsh chemicals to clean their clothes. Imagine wearing the same set of clothes for days, even weeks, without washing them. Imagine the discomfort, the smell, and the risk of infection. Then there's the food. While Chinese cuisine is renowned for its variety and flavor, the diet of the average person in ancient China was often monotonous and limited. Rice was the staple food in the south, while wheat and millet were more common in the north. Vegetables were also consumed, but often in small quantities. Meat was a luxury that most people could only afford to eat on special occasions. Food preservation techniques were primitive, and spoilage was a common problem. Salt was used to preserve meat and fish, but it was expensive and not always effective. Pickling and fermentation were also used to preserve vegetables, but these methods could alter the taste and texture of the food. Imagine eating the same bland meal of rice and vegetables day after day, with little variation. Imagine the frustration of watching your food spoil before you can eat it, knowing that you have no way to replace it. And let's not forget the lack of modern medical care. Antibiotics, vaccines, and advanced surgical techniques were all unknown. Even simple infections could be life-threatening. Childbirth was a particularly dangerous event, with high rates of maternal and infant mortality. Traditional Chinese medicine offered some relief, but it was not always effective. Herbal remedies could be helpful for some ailments, but they were often based on superstition and lacked scientific evidence. Acupuncture and other forms of traditional therapy could provide temporary pain relief, but they could not cure serious diseases. Imagine contracting a simple infection, like a cut or a scratch, and watching it fester and spread, with no way to stop it. Imagine watching your child die from a preventable disease, knowing that there is nothing you can do to save them. The lack of sanitation, poor diet, and limited medical care combined to create a harsh and unforgiving environment. Life expectancy was low, and disease was rampant. The average person in ancient China could expect to live only into their 30s or 40s. Beyond the physical challenges, there were also significant cultural and social differences that would make it difficult for a modern person to adapt to life in ancient China. Is there anything else I can help you with? Language, of course, would be a major barrier. The Chinese language is notoriously difficult to learn, with its complex writing system and tonal pronunciation. Even if you managed to learn some basic phrases, you would still struggle to understand the nuances of conversation and the subtle cues of social interaction. Customs and etiquette were also very different. Respect for elders was paramount, and any sign of disrespect could be met with severe disapproval. Social interactions were highly formalized, with strict rules governing everything from greetings to table manners. Imagine accidentally insulting someone without realizing it and facing the consequences of your ignorance. Imagine struggling to navigate the complex social rituals, feeling like an outsider and a fool. The role of women in ancient Chinese society was particularly restrictive. Women were expected to be subservient to men, and their lives were largely confined to the domestic sphere. They had little or no say in political or economic matters, and their primary duty was to bear children, preferably sons, to continue the family line. Foot binding was a common practice among upper-class women, a cruel and debilitating custom that involved breaking and binding the feet to make them smaller. This practice severely limited women's mobility and reinforced their dependence on men. Imagine being a woman in ancient China, denied the opportunities and freedoms that you take for granted today. Imagine being forced to undergo the agonizing process of foot binding, knowing that it will cripple you for life. Even something as simple as entertainment would be vastly different. Forget your Netflix, your video games, and your social media. Entertainment in ancient China was largely communal and participatory. Storytelling, music, and dance were popular forms of entertainment, but they were often performed by professionals or reserved for special occasions. Gambling was also a popular pastime, but it was often associated with crime and vice. Theaters existed, but they were often rowdy and unsanitary places, and the performances were often crude and bawdy. Imagine being deprived of the modern forms of entertainment that you rely on to relax and unwind. Imagine being forced to find amusement in the simple pleasures of life, like listening to music or telling stories around a campfire. Finally, there's the psychological impact of living in a world so different from your own. The constant stress of trying to survive in a harsh and unforgiving environment, the isolation of being an outsider, the fear of disease and violence, all of these things would take a toll on your mental health. You would likely experience culture shock, a sense of disorientation and anxiety caused by being immersed in a foreign culture. You would miss your family, your friends, and the comforts of your modern life. You would struggle to make sense of the world around you, and you would question your own identity and values. Imagine feeling completely alone and lost in a world that you don't understand. Is there anything else you need help with? Imagine the despair of knowing that you may never see your loved ones again. So while ancient China was a land of great beauty and profound wisdom, it was also a land of immense hardship and suffering. The challenges of surviving in this world were numerous and daunting. From the social hierarchy to the legal system, from famine to war, from hygiene to medical care, the odds were stacked against you. And even if you managed to overcome these challenges, the cultural and social differences would likely prove to be overwhelming. It was a truly different world, a world that would test your limits and push you to the brink. Could you truly survive? The answer, for most of us, is almost certainly no, but even contemplating the difficulties underscores just how much we take for granted in our modern lives. Let's say, against all odds, you did manage to navigate the social hierarchy, avoid the clutches of the legal system, survive a famine or two, and somehow evade being conscripted into a war. Congratulations, you're still not out of the woods, because now you have to contend with superstition. Ancient Chinese society was deeply steeped in superstition. Belief in ghosts, demons, and other supernatural entities was widespread, influencing every aspect of daily life. From the placement of buildings to the timing of important events, decisions were often guided by divination and the advice of shamans or priests. Forget scientific explanations for natural phenomena. In ancient China, eclipses were seen as ominous portents, earthquakes were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, and comets were believed to herald disaster. These beliefs could have a profound impact on public behavior. During an eclipse, for example, people would often bang drums and pots and pans to scare away the celestial dragon that was supposedly devouring the sun or moon. The practice of feng shui, the art of arranging buildings and objects in harmony with the environment, was also deeply rooted in superstition. It was believed that the proper alignment of structures could attract good fortune and ward off evil spirits. Even the location of grave sites was carefully chosen according to feng shui principles, as it was believed that the spirits of the ancestors could influence the lives of their descendants. Imagine trying to build a house or open a business without consulting a feng shui master. You'd be considered foolish, and you might even face social ostracism. Ancestor worship was another central tenet of ancient Chinese belief. It was believed that the spirits of the deceased could influence the lives of the living, and that it was important to honor and appease them through rituals and offerings. Families would maintain ancestral tablets in their homes, and they would regularly offer food, incense, and paper money to their ancestors. Failing to properly honor your ancestors could bring misfortune upon your family. The belief in ghosts and demons was also pervasive. It was believed that spirits of the dead could linger in the world, causing mischief or even harm to the living. Certain places, such as abandoned buildings or graveyards, were considered to be particularly haunted. People would take precautions to protect themselves from these malevolent spirits, such as wearing amulets, burning incense, or reciting incantations. Imagine living in constant fear of ghosts and demons, never knowing when or where they might strike. Divination was used to predict the future and make important decisions. Various methods were employed, including oracle bones, I Ching, the Book of Changes, and astrology. People would consult diviners before embarking on journeys, getting married, or making investments. The advice of diviners was often treated as gospel, even if it contradicted common sense. Imagine relying on divination to make important decisions in your life, trusting the pronouncements of a diviner over your own judgment. Imagine the consequences of making a wrong decision based on faulty divination. Superstition also played a role in medicine. Traditional Chinese medicine was based on the belief that the body was governed by a system of energy flows, or, quote, qi, and that illness was caused by imbalances in this system. Herbal remedies, acupuncture, and other forms of therapy were used to restore balance and promote healing. However, many of these practices were based on superstition and lacked scientific evidence. Imagine relying on herbal remedies and acupuncture to treat a serious illness, knowing that they may not be effective. Imagine the frustration of watching your loved ones suffer, knowing that there is nothing you can do to help them. The prevalence of superstition in ancient Chinese society could have both positive and negative consequences. On the one hand, it could provide people with a sense of meaning and purpose, and it could promote social cohesion. On the other hand, it could lead to irrational behavior, fear, and even violence. Imagine living in a society where superstition is rampant, where people are constantly making decisions based on irrational beliefs. Imagine the challenges of trying to navigate this world, of trying to make sense of the senseless. And then there's the sheer boredom. We're so used to constant stimulation, a never-ending stream of information and entertainment at our fingertips. What would you do all day? Especially if you found yourself in a rural farming community. There would be no internet, no television, no radio, no books, unless you were literate and wealthy, which, let's face it, you probably wouldn't be. Your days would be filled with back-breaking labor, and your evenings would be spent in the dim light of an oil lamp, listening to the same old stories told over and over again. The lack of intellectual stimulation could be particularly challenging for a modern person. We're used to having access to a vast amount of knowledge and information. We're used to being able to learn about anything we want, whenever we want. Are there any other scripts you need me to narrate? In ancient China, however, access to knowledge was limited, and education was reserved for the elite. Imagine being deprived of the intellectual stimulation that you crave. Imagine the frustration of not being able to learn about the things that interest you. The lack of social mobility could also be demoralizing. In ancient China, your fate was largely determined by your birth. If you were born into a peasant family, you were likely to remain a peasant for the rest of your life. There was little opportunity to improve your social standing or to pursue your dreams. Imagine being trapped in a life that you don't want, with no way to escape. Imagine the despair of knowing that you will never achieve your full potential. And let's not forget the language barrier. Even if you managed to learn some basic Chinese, you would still struggle to communicate effectively with the people around you. You would miss the nuances of conversation, the subtle humor, and the shared cultural references. Imagine feeling isolated and alone, unable to connect with the people around you. Imagine the frustration of not being able to express yourself fully. The lack of privacy could also be difficult to adjust to. In ancient China, people lived in close quarters, and privacy was a rare commodity. Families often shared a single room, and there was little opportunity for solitude. Imagine living in constant proximity to other people, with no place to escape and be alone. Imagine the stress of never having any privacy. The constant surveillance could also be unnerving. In ancient China, the government kept a close watch on its citizens. Informants were common, and people were often afraid to speak their minds for fear of being denounced. Imagine living in a society where you are constantly being watched, where you have to be careful about what you say and do. Imagine the paranoia and anxiety that this would create. So even if you managed to survive the physical challenges of ancient China, the psychological and social challenges could be just as daunting. The superstition, the boredom, the lack of intellectual stimulation, the social immobility, the language barrier, the lack of privacy, and the constant surveillance. All of these things would take a toll on your mental health and make it difficult to adapt to life in this very different world. Ultimately, surviving in ancient China would require a complete transformation of your mindset and your way of life. You would have to abandon your modern sensibilities and embrace the values and beliefs of ancient Chinese society. You would have to learn to live with hardship and suffering, and you would have to accept your place in the social hierarchy. You would have to be incredibly resourceful, adaptable, and resilient. And even then, there would be no guarantee of success. The odds were stacked against you, and the challenges were immense. Would you like me to narrate another segment? But perhaps, just perhaps, with a combination of luck, skill, and sheer determination, you might just be able to pull it off. But let's be honest, the odds are astronomically low. You'd have a better chance of winning the lottery while simultaneously being struck by lightning. Twice. Let's consider another often overlooked aspect: medicine. We've touched upon it, but the true scope of its limitations deserves further exploration. Imagine a world without germ theory, without antibiotics, without even a basic understanding of human anatomy as we know it. That was the reality of ancient Chinese medicine for the vast majority of its history. While traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, developed sophisticated systems of diagnosis and treatment based on concepts like qi, yin, and yang, and the 5 elements, its effectiveness was often limited by a lack of empirical evidence and a reliance on superstition. Herbal remedies, acupuncture, moxibustion, burning of mugwort near the skin, and other techniques were used to treat a wide range of ailments, but their efficacy was often unproven and sometimes even harmful. Forget popping a pill for a headache. In ancient China, you might be prescribed a concoction of dried herbs, animal parts, and minerals, based on the principle of restoring balance to your qi. The ingredients could be anything from ginseng and ginger to rhinoceros horn and tiger bones. The taste would likely be awful, and the side effects could be unpredictable, and there would be no guarantee that it would actually work. Surgery was also practiced, but it was often crude and dangerous. Anesthesia was limited to the use of alcohol or opium, and antiseptic techniques were non-existent. Infections were a constant threat, and even minor surgical procedures could be fatal. Imagine undergoing surgery without anesthesia, feeling every cut and stitch. Imagine the excruciating pain, the fear, and the risk of infection. The lack of sanitation and hygiene further exacerbated the problem. Hospitals were rare, and medical care was often provided in unsanitary conditions. Doctors often lacked a basic understanding of hygiene, and they would frequently spread infections from one patient to another. Imagine visiting a doctor only to contract a deadly disease. Childbirth was a particularly dangerous event. Maternal mortality rates were high due to complications such as hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed labor. Midwives lacked the knowledge and skills to handle difficult deliveries, and cesarean sections were rarely performed. Imagine the fear and anxiety of going into labor, knowing that you might not survive the experience. Even common ailments that are easily treated today could be life-threatening in ancient China. A simple cut or scratch could become infected, leading to sepsis and death. Diarrhea could lead to dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, causing organ failure. Pneumonia could quickly overwhelm the lungs, suffocating the victim. Imagine being killed by a disease that is easily curable in the 21st century. And then there were the epidemics. Throughout history, China has been ravaged by outbreaks of deadly diseases, such as plague, smallpox, cholera, and influenza. These epidemics could kill millions of people, decimating entire populations. The lack of effective treatments and preventive measures made these outbreaks particularly devastating. Imagine living through a plague, watching your friends and family die around you, knowing that you are likely to be next. Let's say you develop a persistent cough and fever. You consult a local doctor who diagnoses you with lung heat and prescribes a mixture of herbs and animal parts. You take the medicine religiously, but your condition worsens. You develop shortness of breath and chest pain. You consult another doctor who performs acupuncture and moxibustion. But still, your condition deteriorates. You are eventually diagnosed with pneumonia, but by then it is too late. You die a slow and agonizing death, suffocated by your own lungs. That's just one possible scenario in the brutal reality of ancient Chinese medicine. The lack of knowledge, the lack of technology, and the lack of sanitation made life a constant struggle against disease and death. Adding to the misery was the constant presence of pests. We're not just talking about the occasional mosquito bite. We're talking about infestations that could make your life a living hell. Rats were a constant problem, particularly in urban areas. They would infest homes, businesses, and granaries, spreading disease and contaminating food supplies. Cockroaches were also ubiquitous, crawling over everything and leaving their droppings behind. Fleas and lice were a common affliction, causing itching, irritation, and the spread of diseases like typhus. Bedbugs were a particular nuisance, infesting beds and furniture and feeding on human blood. Their bites could cause intense itching and swelling, making it difficult to sleep. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep in a bed infested with bedbugs. Mosquitoes were a constant threat, particularly in the summer months. They would swarm around homes and businesses, biting people and spreading diseases like malaria and dengue fever. Flies were also a nuisance, buzzing around food and spreading bacteria. Controlling these pests was a constant challenge. Insecticides were primitive and often ineffective. Traps were used to catch rats and other rodents, but they were not always successful. The best defense was to maintain good sanitation and hygiene, but this was not always possible in crowded and unsanitary conditions. Imagine living in a home infested with rats, cockroaches, fleas, lice, bedbugs, mosquitoes, and flies. Imagine the constant itching, the buzzing, the crawling, and the fear of disease. And then there were the snakes. China is home to a variety of venomous snakes, and snake bites were a common occurrence, particularly in rural areas. A snake bite could cause severe pain, swelling, and even death. Imagine being bitten by a venomous snake while working in the fields. Scorpions were also a threat, particularly in dry and arid regions. Their stings could cause intense pain and swelling, and in rare cases, they could be fatal. Imagine being stung by a scorpion while sleeping in your bed. Spiders were another source of concern. While most spiders are harmless, some species are venomous and can cause painful bites. Imagine being bitten by a venomous spider while walking through the forest. The constant threat of pests and venomous creatures added another layer of stress to life in ancient China. It was a world where you had to be constantly vigilant, always on the lookout for danger. And what about something as seemingly simple as travel? We hop in our cars, board airplanes, or take trains without a second thought. In ancient China, travel was a major undertaking, fraught with peril and discomfort. Roads were often poorly maintained, making travel slow and arduous. Bandits were a constant threat, particularly in remote areas. Weather conditions could be unpredictable, and travelers could be stranded by floods, snowstorms, or extreme heat. Traveling by foot was the most common method, but it was also the most tiring and time-consuming. People would often walk for days or even weeks to reach their destination. Imagine walking hundreds of miles in uncomfortable shoes, carrying all of your belongings on your back. Traveling by cart or wagon was more comfortable, but it was also more expensive. Carts and wagons were typically pulled by oxen or horses, and they could only travel at a slow pace. Imagine riding in a bumpy cart for days on end, exposed to the elements and the dust of the road. Traveling by boat was another option, particularly in areas with navigable rivers and canals. Boats were faster and more comfortable than carts or wagons, but they were also more expensive and susceptible to accidents. Imagine traveling on a crowded boat, surrounded by strangers, with the constant risk of capsizing. Inns and lodging houses were available along major trade routes, but they were often dirty and uncomfortable. Food was often scarce and expensive, and travelers had to be wary of theft and violence. Imagine staying in a dingy inn, surrounded by strangers, with the constant fear of being robbed or attacked. Even something as simple as finding a place to relieve yourself could be a challenge. Public restrooms were rare, and people often had to relieve themselves in the open. Imagine the embarrassment and discomfort of having to relieve yourself in public. Traveling in ancient China was not for the faint of heart. It was a test of endurance, resilience, and resourcefulness. It was a world where you had to be prepared for anything, from bandits to bad weather to bed bugs. Let's say you decide to travel to a distant city to seek your fortune. You pack your belongings and set off on foot. You walk for days, braving the heat, the rain, and the dust. You encounter bandits who rob you of your money and your possessions. You sleep in dingy inns, where you are bitten by bedbugs and kept awake by the noise. You finally arrive at your destination, exhausted, hungry, and penniless. That's just one possible scenario in the challenging reality of ancient Chinese travel. Would you like me to narrate another script? The lack of infrastructure, the lack of safety, and the lack of comfort made travel a major undertaking, fraught with peril and discomfort. And finally, let's consider the sheer lack of personal freedom. We take for granted our right to speak our minds, to choose our own careers, to travel freely, and to associate with whomever we please. In ancient China, these freedoms were severely restricted. The government exercised tight control over every aspect of life, from the economy to the culture to the personal lives of its citizens. Censorship was rampant, and people were often afraid to express dissenting opinions for fear of being punished. Social mobility was limited, and people were often trapped in the social class into which they were born. The government controlled access to education and employment, and it favored those who were loyal to the ruling dynasty. Travel was restricted, and people were often required to obtain permission from the government before traveling to other parts of the country. The government kept a close watch on its citizens, and informants were common. Personal relationships were also subject to government control. Marriages were often arranged by families, and individuals had little say in who they would marry. The government regulated family size, and it encouraged people to have children, particularly sons, to increase the population. Even religious beliefs were subject to government control. The government promoted Confucianism as the official ideology, and it suppressed other religions that it deemed to be subversive. Imagine living in a society where you are constantly being watched, where you are afraid to speak your mind, where you have little control over your own life. Imagine the frustration, the oppression, and the lack of hope. Let's say you express a dissenting opinion about the government. You are denounced by your neighbors and arrested by the authorities. You are tortured and imprisoned for years. When you are finally released, You are ostracized by your community and unable to find work. You are forced to live a life of poverty and despair. That's just one possible scenario in the oppressive reality of ancient Chinese society. The lack of personal freedom, the constant surveillance, and the government control made life a constant struggle for autonomy and self-expression. So you've managed to avoid starvation, dodge the plague, and keep your mouth shut enough to avoid the wrath of the authorities. You're doing better than most, but there's one more crucial element we need to consider, one that permeated every aspect of ancient Chinese life, one that could determine your success or failure, your happiness or misery. Relationships. Ancient Chinese society was fundamentally collectivist. Individualism as we understand it today was largely absent. Your identity was defined by your relationships, your family, your clan, your village, your place in the social hierarchy. Maintaining harmonious relationships was not just a matter of personal preference. It was a moral imperative, essential for the stability of society. The cornerstone of these relationships was filial piety, the deep respect and obedience owed to one's parents and ancestors. This wasn't just a matter of saying please and thank you. It was a lifelong commitment to honoring their wishes, caring for them in their old age, and performing the proper rituals to ensure their well-being in the afterlife. Disobeying your parents, neglecting their needs, or failing to perform the proper ancestral rites was considered a grave offense, a betrayal of your filial duty that could bring shame upon your entire family. Imagine being told that you have to marry someone you don't love because your parents have arranged a match that will benefit the family. Imagine sacrificing your own dreams and ambitions to fulfill your parents' expectations. Imagine spending your entire life caring for your aging parents, even if it means sacrificing your own personal happiness. That was the reality of filial piety in ancient China. Beyond filial piety, there were other important relationships that governed social interactions. The 5 relationships, as defined by Confucianism, outline the proper conduct between ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, elder sibling and younger sibling, and friend and friend. Each relationship was characterized by a specific set of obligations and responsibilities. The relationship between ruler and subject was based on loyalty and obedience. Subjects were expected to obey the ruler's commands and to serve him faithfully. In return, the ruler was expected to govern justly and to provide for the welfare of his people. The relationship between husband and wife was based on mutual respect and support. The husband was responsible for providing for his family, while the wife was responsible for managing the household and raising the children. However, the husband was generally considered to be the head of the household, and the wife was expected to be subservient to him. The relationship between elder sibling and younger sibling was based on respect and guidance. The elder sibling was responsible for setting a good example for the younger sibling, and for providing guidance and support. The younger sibling was expected to respect and obey the elder sibling. The relationship between friend and friend was based on loyalty and trust. Friends were expected to support each other in times of need and to offer honest advice and criticism. Maintaining harmonious relationships was not always easy. Conflicts and disagreements were inevitable, but it was important to resolve them peacefully and respectfully. Losing face, or causing someone else to lose face, was considered a serious social faux pas. It was important to maintain harmony and avoid conflict at all costs. Imagine being caught in the middle of a family feud. Imagine being forced to choose between your loyalty to your parents and your loyalty to your siblings. Imagine the stress and anxiety of trying to maintain harmonious relationships with everyone around you. And let's not forget the importance of guanxi, the network of personal connections that played a crucial role in ancient Chinese society. Guanxi was based on mutual obligation and reciprocity. If you did someone a favor, they were expected to return the favor in the future. Building a strong network of guanxi was essential for success in business, politics, and social life. Imagine trying to start a business without any guanxi. Imagine trying to navigate the bureaucratic maze without knowing the right people. Imagine the frustration of being excluded from social gatherings because you don't have the right connections. In short, relationships were the glue that held ancient Chinese society together. Maintaining harmonious relationships was essential for survival, success, and happiness. If you failed to navigate the complex web of social obligations and responsibilities, you would likely find yourself isolated, marginalized, and miserable. So, to survive in ancient China, you wouldn't just need physical strength, intelligence, and resilience. You would also need exceptional social skills, a deep understanding of Chinese culture, and an unwavering commitment to maintaining harmonious relationships. It was a world where who you knew was often more important than what you knew. And let's not forget the constant pressure to conform. Individuality was often frowned upon, and people were expected to adhere to strict social norms. Standing out from the crowd, expressing unconventional opinions, or challenging the status quo could be risky. Imagine being forced to suppress your own individuality and conform to the expectations of society. Imagine the frustration of not being able to express your true self. The pressure to conform extended to every aspect of life, from clothing to behavior to even thoughts. People were expected to dress modestly, to speak politely, and to avoid any behavior that could be considered scandalous or offensive. Imagine being constantly judged by others and being afraid to do anything that might displease them. Imagine the stress of living in a society where conformity is valued above all else. And then there's the issue of gender roles. We've touched on this before, but it's worth emphasizing just how restrictive these roles were, particularly for women. Women were expected to be subservient to men, and their lives were largely confined to the domestic sphere. They had little or no say in political or economic matters, and their primary duty was to bear children, preferably sons, to continue the family line. Education for women was limited, and they were often discouraged from pursuing careers or other activities outside the home. Their value was primarily determined by their ability to bear children and to serve their husbands and families. Imagine being a woman in ancient China, denied the opportunities and freedoms that you take for granted today. Imagine being forced to live a life of subservience and confinement. Even seemingly minor transgressions could have serious consequences. Gossiping, spreading rumors, or engaging in petty theft could lead to public shaming, social ostracism, or even imprisonment. Imagine being accused of gossiping and being publicly shamed in front of your entire village. Imagine the humiliation and the loss of reputation, the constant fear of making a mistake, of offending someone, or of violating social norms could be incredibly stressful. It was a world where you had to be constantly vigilant, always on your best behavior, and let's not forget the ever-present threat of violence. While ancient Chinese society valued harmony and order, violence was also a reality of daily life. Bandits roamed the countryside, preying on travelers and villagers. Gangs controlled the streets of the cities, engaging in extortion, gambling, and other illegal activities. Feuds between families and clans could erupt into violent clashes. The government used force to maintain order and suppress dissent. Public executions were common, and torture was used to extract confessions. Imagine witnessing a public execution, seeing the brutality of the state firsthand. Even within families, violence was not uncommon. Husbands could beat their wives, parents could beat their children, and masters could beat their servants. There was little recourse for victims of domestic violence. Imagine being a victim of domestic violence with no one to turn to for help. Imagine the fear, the pain, and the helplessness. The constant threat of violence added another layer of anxiety to life in ancient China. It was a world where you had to be constantly aware of your surroundings and where you could never feel completely safe. Let's say you witness a crime and report it to the authorities. The criminals are powerful and well-connected, and they retaliate by attacking you and your family. You are left injured and traumatized, with no faith in the justice system. That's just one possible scenario in the violent reality of ancient Chinese society. The lack of law and order, the power of criminal gangs, and the acceptance of violence made life a constant struggle for survival. So to truly understand why you wouldn't survive in ancient China, you need to appreciate the complex web of social relationships, the pressure to conform, the restrictive gender roles, and the constant threat of violence. It was a world that demanded absolute obedience, unwavering loyalty, and a willingness to sacrifice your own individuality for the sake of the collective. It was a world that was both fascinating and terrifying, beautiful and brutal. For most of us, it would be a world that we simply wouldn't be able to survive. But let's say, just for argument's sake, that you did possess all the necessary skills and attributes. You were fluent in Chinese, knowledgeable about Confucianism, skilled in martial arts, and blessed with exceptional social intelligence. Even then, your survival would depend on a significant amount of luck. A single stroke of bad luck, a bad harvest, a natural disaster, a political upheaval could undo all of your hard work and leave you destitute. A chance encounter with a corrupt official or a vengeful enemy could land you in prison or even lead to your death. A sudden illness could rob you of your health and your livelihood. Life in ancient China was precarious, and even the most skilled and resourceful individuals could be brought down by circumstances beyond their control. It was a world where fate played a significant role, and where even the best laid plans could be thwarted by unforeseen events. Imagine spending years building a successful business, only to have it destroyed by a fire or a flood. Imagine dedicating your life to serving the emperor, only to be betrayed by a rival and executed for treason. Imagine working tirelessly to provide for your family, only to have them die from a preventable disease. The capriciousness of fate was a constant source of anxiety and uncertainty in ancient Chinese society. People would often seek to appease the gods and spirits, hoping to ward off bad luck and attract good fortune. They would consult diviners, perform rituals, and make offerings, all in an attempt to influence the course of events. But even with all of these precautions, there was no guarantee of success. Fate was a powerful force, and it could strike at any time without warning. Imagine living in a world where you are constantly at the mercy of fate, where even the smallest event could have life-altering consequences. Imagine the stress and anxiety of never knowing what the future holds. And let's not forget the psychological impact of living in such a harsh and unforgiving environment. The constant stress of trying to survive, the fear of disease and violence, the pressure to conform, and the lack of personal freedom would take a toll on your mental health. You might experience anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. You might struggle to maintain your sanity in the face of constant adversity. You might lose faith in humanity and become cynical and disillusioned. Imagine watching your friends and family die from starvation or disease. Imagine being forced to commit acts of violence to survive. Imagine losing everything that you hold dear. The psychological challenges of living in ancient China would be immense, and many people would likely succumb to despair and hopelessness. It was a world that would test your limits and push you to the brink. So even if you possessed all the necessary skills, attributes, and luck, you would still face a formidable psychological challenge. The constant stress, fear, and uncertainty would take a toll on your mental health and make it difficult to maintain a positive outlook. Ultimately, surviving in ancient China would require more than just physical and mental strength. It would require a deep sense of resilience, an unwavering commitment to your values, and a willingness to accept the things that you cannot change. It would require a spirit that is both tough and compassionate, both pragmatic and idealistic. Do you want me to read another script? And even then, there would be no guarantee of success. But perhaps with enough luck, skill, and determination, you might just be able to make it. But let's be realistic, the odds are overwhelmingly against you. You'd be better off trying to herd cats while juggling chainsaws during an earthquake. And that, in a nutshell, is why you probably wouldn't survive in ancient China. It was a world that was vastly different from our own. A world that demanded a level of resilience, adaptability, and social intelligence that most of us simply don't possess. It was a world that was both fascinating and terrifying, beautiful and brutal. And while it's fun to imagine ourselves as intrepid time travelers, the reality is that we would likely be overwhelmed by the challenges and crushed by the hardships. So the next time you complain about your job, your commute, or your internet connection, remember the people who lived and died in ancient China. Remember their struggles, their sacrifices, and their triumphs. And be grateful for the comforts and freedoms that we enjoy today. Because in the grand scheme of things, we have it pretty good. Of course, we've painted a rather bleak picture, haven't we? A constant barrage of hardship, oppression, and impending doom. But it's important to remember that ancient China wasn't entirely devoid of positive aspects. It wasn't all just famine and foot binding, though those were certainly significant parts of the reality for many. There were moments of beauty, innovation, and profound human connection that made life worth living, even in the face of adversity. Let's consider the arts. Ancient China was a cradle of artistic expression, producing some of the most exquisite and enduring works of art in human history. From the delicate brushstrokes of calligraphy to the intricate carvings of jade, from the soaring melodies of traditional music to the captivating performances of opera, the arts provided a source of solace, inspiration, and cultural pride. Imagine attending a performance of Peking opera with its vibrant costumes, elaborate makeup, and acrobatic feats. Imagine being transported to another world by the soaring voices of the singers and the rhythmic beat of the drums. Imagine the sheer spectacle of the performance, a feast for the senses that would leave you breathless. Or consider the beauty of Chinese gardens, carefully designed landscapes that sought to capture the essence of nature in miniature. These gardens were not just places of aesthetic beauty, they were also places of contemplation and reflection, where one could escape the pressures of daily life and reconnect with the natural world. Imagine wandering through a serene garden, surrounded by lush greenery, tranquil ponds, and winding pathways. Imagine the feeling of peace and tranquility that would wash over you as you listened to the gentle sounds of nature. Calligraphy was another highly revered art form in ancient China. It was not just a means of communication, it was also a way of expressing one's inner self. Do you want me to continue? Calligraphers would spend years perfecting their brushstrokes, striving to achieve a perfect balance of form and expression. Imagine watching a master calligrapher at work, their brush dancing across the paper with effortless grace. Imagine the beauty and power of their strokes, conveying a sense of energy and emotion that transcends words. And let's not forget the rich literary tradition of ancient China, from the philosophical writings of Confucius and Lao Tzu to the epic poems of Li Bai and Du Fu. Chinese literature offered a wealth of wisdom, insight, and artistic expression. Imagine reading the Analects of Confucius, pondering his teachings on ethics, morality, and social harmony. Imagine being moved by the beauty and power of Li Bai's poetry, celebrating the wonders of nature and the joys of friendship. The arts provided a vital source of inspiration and comfort in ancient China, offering a glimpse of beauty and transcendence amidst the hardships of daily life. They were a testament to the human spirit's ability to find meaning and purpose, even in the face of adversity. Then there's the intellectual ferment. Despite the emphasis on conformity and obedience, ancient China was also a place of intellectual innovation and philosophical debate. Thinkers like Confucius, Lao Tzu, and Mencius developed profound ethical and philosophical systems that continue to influence Chinese culture to this day. The Confucian emphasis on education, meritocracy, and social harmony helped create a relatively stable and prosperous society, despite its many challenges. The Taoist emphasis on living in harmony with nature inspired a deep appreciation for the natural world. The legalist emphasis on law and order helped to maintain social control and prevent chaos. Imagine engaging in a lively debate with a Confucian scholar, discussing the merits of different philosophical approaches. Imagine being challenged to think critically and to question your own assumptions. The intellectual ferment of ancient China helped to shape its culture, its institutions, and its values. It was a testament to the power of human reason and the importance of intellectual freedom. And let's not forget the technological innovations. Ancient China was a pioneer in many fields of technology, developing inventions that would revolutionize the world. The invention of paper and printing, for example, made it possible to disseminate knowledge and ideas on a scale that was previously unimaginable. The invention of gunpowder transformed warfare and had a profound impact on global history. The invention of the compass made it possible to navigate the seas with greater accuracy, leading to new discoveries and trade routes. Imagine the excitement of witnessing the first printing press in action, churning out books and pamphlets at an unprecedented rate. Imagine the awe of seeing a rocket launch for the first time, propelled by the power of gunpowder. The technological innovations of ancient China helped to improve the lives of its people, to expand its horizons, and to shape the course of history. They were a testament to the ingenuity and creativity of the human mind. Furthermore, consider the strong sense of community. Despite the social hierarchy and the pressure to conform, ancient Chinese society was also characterized by a strong sense of community. People relied on each other for support, assistance, and companionship. Families, clans, and villages provided a safety net for their members, offering assistance in times of need. Neighbors would help each other with farming, building, and other tasks. Festivals and celebrations brought people together, fostering a sense of shared identity and belonging. Imagine participating in a village festival, dancing, singing, and celebrating with your neighbors. Imagine the feeling of camaraderie and belonging that would wash over you. The strong sense of community in ancient China helped to mitigate the hardships of daily life and to provide a sense of meaning and purpose. It was a testament to the human need for connection and belonging. And let's not forget the simple joys of life. Despite the challenges and hardships, people in ancient China also found joy in simple things, such as spending time with family and friends, enjoying a good meal, or watching a beautiful sunset. They would celebrate birthdays, weddings, and other special occasions with elaborate feasts and festivities. They would gather together to tell stories, sing songs, and play games. They would find pleasure in the beauty of nature, the taste of good food, and the warmth of human companionship. Imagine sharing a meal with your family, laughing and talking as you enjoyed the simple pleasures of life. Imagine watching a beautiful sunset, feeling grateful for the blessings of the day. These simple joys provided a source of comfort and resilience in ancient China, reminding people that life was worth living, even in the face of adversity. They were a testament to the human capacity for happiness and contentment. So, while it's important to acknowledge the hardships and challenges of ancient Chinese life, it's also important to remember the positive aspects, the arts, the intellectual ferment, the technological innovations, the strong sense of community, and the simple joys of life all contributed to making ancient China a vibrant and complex society. It wasn't all just famine and foot binding. There were also moments of beauty, innovation, and profound human connection that made life worth living, even in the face of adversity. And perhaps, if you were lucky and resourceful enough, you might even be able to find a measure of happiness and fulfillment in this ancient world. But let's be honest, it would be an uphill battle, a constant struggle against the odds. And even if you managed to survive, you would likely be forever changed by the experience. You would never look at the world in the same way again. You would appreciate the comforts and freedoms that we enjoy today, and you would be grateful for the simple things in life. Would you like me to narrate another script? So while it's unlikely that you would survive in ancient China, it's worth considering the possibility, if only to gain a deeper appreciation for the world we live in today. Because in the end, that's what history is all about. Understanding the past so that we can better understand the present and shape a better future. And that's the paradox of history, isn't it? We recoil at the hardships, the injustices, the sheer brutality of the past. We shudder to think of ourselves transported back, forced to endure conditions that seem utterly unbearable. And yet we also find ourselves drawn to the stories of those who did survive, who thrived even, in those very circumstances. We admire their resilience, their ingenuity, their unwavering spirit. We see in them a reflection of our own potential, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure. Perhaps then, the question isn't simply, would I survive, but rather, how would I choose to live? Faced with the constraints of ancient Chinese society, what values would I cling to? What principles would I defend? What kind of person would I become? Would I succumb to despair and bitterness? Or would I find a way to cultivate hope and meaning? Would I prioritize my own survival above all else? Or would I risk my life to help others? Would I conform to the expectations of society? Or would I dare to challenge the status quo? These are difficult questions, and there are no easy answers. But by grappling with them, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and of the choices that we face in our own lives. Let's consider a few hypothetical scenarios. Imagine you were a peasant farmer, struggling to eke out a living from the land. You would face constant threats from drought, famine, and bandits. You would be burdened by heavy taxes and forced labor. You would have little or no access to education or medical care. In this scenario, your primary focus would likely be on survival. You would work tirelessly to provide for your family, and you would do whatever it took to protect them from harm. You might turn to religion or superstition for comfort and guidance. You might find solace in the simple pleasures of life, such as spending time with loved ones or enjoying a good meal. Or imagine you were a wealthy merchant, trading goods along the Silk Road. You would enjoy a comfortable lifestyle with access to luxury goods and cultural experiences. You would have the opportunity to travel to distant lands and to interact with people from different cultures. In this scenario, you might be more concerned with wealth and status. You might strive to accumulate more possessions and to climb the social ladder. You might use your wealth to support charitable causes or to patronize the arts. Or imagine you were a scholar official serving in the imperial bureaucracy. Would you like me to continue? You would have the opportunity to influence government policy and to shape the course of history. You would be expected to uphold the Confucian values of integrity, loyalty, and service. In this scenario, you might be more concerned with honor and duty. You might strive to serve the emperor and the people to the best of your ability. You might be willing to sacrifice your own personal interests for the greater good. Each of these scenarios presents its own unique challenges and opportunities, and the choices that you would make would depend on your own values, beliefs, and personality. But regardless of your social status or your personal circumstances, there are certain qualities that would be essential for survival and success in ancient China. These qualities include resilience, adaptability, resourcefulness, and social intelligence. Resilience is the ability to bounce back from adversity. It's the capacity to cope with stress, to overcome challenges, and to learn from your mistakes. Adaptability is the ability to adjust to changing circumstances. It's the willingness to embrace new ideas, to learn new skills, and to adapt to new environments. Resourcefulness is the ability to find creative solutions to problems. It's the capacity to make the most of limited resources and to overcome obstacles with ingenuity and determination. Social intelligence is the ability to understand and interact effectively with other people. It's the capacity to build relationships, to communicate clearly, and to navigate complex social situations. These qualities are valuable in any society, but they would be particularly important in ancient China, a society defined by scarcity, rigid social structures, and constant pressure to conform. By cultivating these qualities, you would increase your chances of survival, success, and even happiness. And even if you ultimately fail to thrive, you would at least be able to face your fate with dignity and courage. You would be able to say that you did your best, that you lived your life according to your own values, and that you left the world a little bit better than you found it. So while it's true that most of us wouldn't survive in ancient China, it's also true that we can learn valuable lessons from the people who did. We can learn about resilience, adaptability, resourcefulness, and social intelligence. We can learn about the importance of community, the power of the human spirit, and the enduring quest for meaning and purpose. And perhaps, by studying the past, we can gain a better understanding of ourselves and of the choices that we face in our own lives. We can learn to appreciate the freedoms and opportunities that we have today, and we can strive to create a better world for future generations. Because in the end, that's what history is all about. Not just memorizing dates and names, but understanding the human experience in all its complexity and richness. It's about learning from the past so that we can build a better future. And even if we wouldn't survive in ancient China, we can still learn from its lessons and apply them to our own lives. One final thought to consider. We've focused largely on the challenges of surviving as an outsider. But what if you were born into this society? What if you knew no other way of life? Would you still feel the same sense of deprivation? Would you still chafe against the restrictions and hardships? Or would you simply accept them as the natural order of things? This is a difficult question to answer, and it highlights the importance of perspective. We tend to judge the past through the lens of our own present-day values and assumptions. We assume that everyone in the past would have wanted the same things that we want today: freedom, equality, prosperity, and happiness. But that's not necessarily true. People in the past had different values, different priorities, and different ways of understanding the world. They may have found meaning and fulfillment in ways that we can't even imagine. So it's important to avoid imposing our own values on the past. We need to try to understand the past on its own terms, to see it through the eyes of the people who lived it. That doesn't mean that we have to condone or excuse the injustices of the past, but it does mean that we need to be careful about judging the past too harshly. We need to remember that people in the past were products of their time, and that they made the best choices they could, given the circumstances they faced. And perhaps, if we were born into ancient Chinese society, we would have made the same choices that they did. We would have adapted to the conditions, embraced the values, and found a way to make a life for ourselves. We might not have thrived, but we would have survived. And perhaps, in the end, that's all that really matters. So, the next time you find yourself wondering whether you would survive in ancient China, remember the words of the philosopher Seneca: "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end." The ancient Chinese civilization, with all its complexities and contradictions, eventually gave way to new forms of society, new ways of life. And in that sense, even in its passing, it contributed to the world we inhabit today. And now, that chapter is closed. For now. Okay. Let's shift gears slightly. We've talked about the macro-level challenges: societal structures, disease, the constant grind of daily life. But what about the micro? What seemingly insignificant details of daily existence would drive a modern person absolutely bonkers in ancient China? Think about personal hygiene. We're accustomed to daily showers, readily available soap, and a plethora of deodorants and perfumes to mask any lingering odors. In ancient China, bathing was a far less frequent occurrence, often dictated by the seasons or special occasions, rather than daily routine. Soap, while it existed in rudimentary forms, wasn't the ubiquitous, pleasantly scented product we know today. It was often made from ash and animal fats, and its primary purpose was cleaning rather than fragrancing. Imagine going weeks, maybe even months, without a proper shower. Imagine the accumulated grime, the persistent body odor, the general feeling of being unclean. It would be a constant source of discomfort and self-consciousness. And it wouldn't just be you. Everyone around you would be in the same boat, creating a rather pungent olfactory environment. And then there's the issue of dental hygiene. Toothbrushes existed, often made from animal bristles attached to bone or bamboo handles. But toothpaste was a far cry from the minty fresh concoctions we use today. It might consist of ground up herbs, salt, or even bone ash. The effectiveness of these rudimentary dental hygiene practices was limited, leading to widespread tooth decay, gum disease, and bad breath. Imagine the constant toothaches, the bleeding gums, the difficulty chewing food. Imagine the embarrassment of having visibly rotten teeth and perpetually bad breath. It would be a constant source of pain and social awkwardness. Let's move on to clothing. We're accustomed to comfortable, breathable fabrics like cotton and linen. In ancient China, clothing was often made from silk, hemp, or ramie. While silk was luxurious, it was also expensive and not readily available to the common people. Hemp and ramie were more affordable, but they were also coarser and less comfortable. Imagine wearing rough, scratchy clothing all day long, especially in the heat of summer. Imagine the chafing, the itching, and the general discomfort. It would be a constant source of irritation. Furthermore, the styles of clothing were often restrictive and impractical. Long, flowing robes and elaborate headdresses were common, especially among the upper classes. These garments could be cumbersome and difficult to move in, making even simple tasks a challenge. Imagine trying to work in the fields or perform household chores while wearing a long, flowing robe that kept getting in the way. Imagine the frustration and inconvenience. And let's not forget the footwear. Shoes were often made from straw, cloth, or leather, and they provided limited support and protection. High heels, while they did exist in some forms, were not designed for comfort or practicality. They were often worn by women of the upper classes to enhance their appearance, but they could also make walking difficult and painful. Imagine walking for miles on rough, uneven terrain in uncomfortable shoes. Imagine the blisters, the sore feet, and the general exhaustion. Now, let's talk about food. While Chinese cuisine is renowned for its variety and flavor, the daily diet of the average person in ancient China was often monotonous and limited. Rice was the staple food, supplemented by vegetables, beans, and occasionally meat or fish. Imagine eating rice every day for every meal. Imagine the lack of variety and the monotony of the diet. It would be a constant source of boredom and dissatisfaction. Furthermore, the quality and availability of food could vary greatly depending on the season and the region. During times of drought or famine, food could become scarce and expensive, leading to widespread hunger and malnutrition. Imagine going days without enough to eat, feeling the gnawing pangs of hunger in your stomach. Imagine the desperation of watching your family starve. The lack of refrigeration and food preservation techniques also meant that food could spoil quickly, especially in hot weather. This could lead to food poisoning and other illnesses. Imagine eating food that is slightly spoiled, knowing that it could make you sick. Imagine the anxiety and uncertainty. And let's not forget the table manners. While Chinese cuisine is often enjoyed communally, with dishes shared among diners, the etiquette surrounding eating could be quite strict and formal. There were specific rules about how to hold your chopsticks, how to serve food to others, and how to express your appreciation for the meal. Imagine accidentally violating one of these rules and causing offense to your host. Imagine the embarrassment and social awkwardness. All right, let's talk about light. We flip a switch and flood a room with bright, consistent light. In ancient China, darkness reigned supreme after sunset. The primary sources of light were candles, oil lamps, and the moon. Candles were expensive and reserved for the wealthy. Oil lamps provided a dim, flickering light that was often smoky and smelly. The moon was the most reliable source of light, but it was only available on clear nights. Imagine trying to read, write, or perform other tasks in the dim light of an oil lamp. Imagine the eye strain, the headaches, and the general frustration. The lack of adequate lighting also made it difficult to navigate at night, increasing the risk of accidents and injuries. Imagine stumbling through the darkness, trying to avoid tripping over obstacles or falling into ditches. Imagine the fear and anxiety of being alone in the dark. And let's not forget the insects. Mosquitoes, flies, and other insects were a constant nuisance, especially in the summer months. They would swarm around homes and businesses, biting people and spreading diseases. Imagine being constantly bitten by mosquitoes, feeling the itching and irritation. Imagine the sleepless nights, the constant swatting, and the fear of contracting a mosquito-borne illness. The lack of effective pest control measures meant that people were often forced to endure these insects without relief. Imagine living in a world where you are constantly surrounded by insects, where you can never escape their annoying presence. Imagine the frustration and discomfort. These seemingly minor details of daily existence, the lack of hygiene, the uncomfortable clothing, the limited diet, the inadequate lighting, the constant presence of insects, would all contribute to making life in ancient China a constant struggle. They would wear you down, both physically and mentally, and make it difficult to maintain a positive outlook. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine ourselves living in a simpler, more idyllic time. But the reality is that life in ancient China was often harsh, uncomfortable, and unforgiving. And while there were certainly moments of beauty, innovation, and human connection, these moments were often overshadowed by the daily grind of survival. So the next time you take a hot shower, brush your teeth, or flip on a light switch, remember the people who lived in ancient China. Remember their struggles, their sacrifices, and their resilience. And be grateful for the comforts and conveniences that we enjoy today, because in the grand scheme of things, we have it pretty good. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to make up for the lack of dragons and emperors. Let's dial back the despair a little. Let's talk about something that might actually make life bearable. Something that might even make you want to stay in ancient China, despite all the aforementioned hardships. The food. Yes, we just discussed the monotonous diet of the average peasant, but the culinary landscape of ancient China was far more diverse and sophisticated than simple rice and vegetables. For those with the means, dining could be a truly exquisite experience. A celebration of flavors, textures, and aromas. Think about the regional cuisines. Each region of China developed its own unique culinary traditions, influenced by local ingredients, climate, and cultural preferences. Sichuan cuisine, known for its bold and spicy flavors, would tantalize your taste buds with its use of chili peppers, Sichuan peppercorns, and fermented bean paste. Cantonese cuisine, renowned for its delicate flavors and fresh ingredients, would delight you with its steamed fish, roasted meats, and stir-fried vegetables. Jiangsu cuisine, characterized by its elegant presentation and subtle flavors, would impress you with its braised pork belly, drunken chicken, and sweet and sour mandarin fish. Imagine sampling the delicacies of each region, experiencing the diverse flavors and textures that ancient China had to offer. Imagine the culinary adventure, the exploration of new tastes and sensations. And then there are the specific dishes. Peking duck, with its crispy skin and succulent meat, was a culinary masterpiece that was often reserved for special occasions. Dim sum, a collection of bite-sized dumplings and pastries, offered a delightful variety of flavors and textures. Noodles, in their countless forms and preparations, were a staple food that could be enjoyed in soups, stir-fries, or even as a cold salad. Imagine savoring the crispy skin of Peking duck, the delicate flavors of dim sum, or the satisfying chewiness of hand-pulled noodles. Imagine the culinary artistry, the skill and dedication that went into creating these dishes. Let's not forget the tea. Tea was more than just a beverage in ancient China. It was a cultural institution, a symbol of hospitality, and a source of relaxation and contemplation. Different types of tea were enjoyed in different regions and at different times of day, each with its own unique flavor and aroma. Imagine sipping a cup of fragrant green tea on a warm summer afternoon, feeling the stress of the day melt away. Imagine the subtle flavors, the delicate aroma, and the calming effect of the tea. And then there are the fruits and vegetables. While the selection may have been limited compared to what we have today, ancient China still offered a variety of fresh and flavorful produce. Peaches, plums, apricots, and persimmons were enjoyed in the summer months. Cabbage, radishes, and turnips were available year-round. And exotic fruits like lychees and longans were imported from distant lands. Imagine biting into a juicy peach, feeling the sweetness explode in your mouth. Imagine the simple pleasure of savoring fresh, seasonal produce. Of course, access to these culinary delights was largely dependent on your social status and your financial resources. The average peasant farmer would have to content themselves with a simple diet of rice and vegetables, while the wealthy elite could indulge in elaborate feasts and exotic delicacies. But even for those with limited means, food could still be a source of pleasure and community. Families would gather together to share meals, celebrating special occasions, and strengthening their bonds. Neighbors would exchange food and recipes, sharing their culinary knowledge and skills. Imagine sharing a simple meal with your family, laughing and talking as you enjoyed each other's company. Imagine the warmth and connection that would come from sharing food with loved ones. So while it's true that food security was a major challenge in ancient China, it's also true that food could be a source of joy, comfort, and community. And for those with the means, dining could be a truly exquisite experience, a celebration of the senses, and a testament to the culinary artistry of the Chinese people. Perhaps, if you were lucky enough to find yourself in a position of privilege, you might even be able to forget about the hardships of daily life for a few hours, as you savor the flavors and aromas of a delicious meal. It might be a fleeting escape, but it could be enough to keep you going, to give you the strength to face another day. And let's not forget the alcohol. Fermented beverages were a staple of ancient Chinese society, providing a source of relaxation, social lubrication, and even ritualistic significance. While wine, made from grapes, existed, it was often less common and more expensive than other alcoholic drinks. The most popular options were typically made from grains like rice, millet, or sorghum. These could range from lightly fermented, sweet beverages to potent distilled spirits. Imagine yourself in a bustling tavern, the air thick with the smell of roasted meats and fermenting grains. You're surrounded by boisterous laughter and the clinking of cups. A server approaches with a steaming pot of rice wine, its aroma both sweet and slightly sour. You take a sip, feeling the warmth spread through your chest as you join in the revelry. Different regions had their own special brews, each with its unique character. Some were flavored with herbs and spices, adding complexity and medicinal properties. Others were aged in earthenware jars, developing rich and nuanced flavors over time. Drinking wasn't just a pastime, it was often an integral part of social interactions. Sharing a cup of wine with a friend or colleague was a sign of respect and camaraderie. Business deals were often sealed over drinks, and important decisions were made in the relaxed atmosphere of a tavern. However, excessive drinking was also frowned upon. Drunkenness was seen as a sign of weakness and lack of self-control. It was important to maintain a balance between enjoying the pleasures of alcohol and avoiding the pitfalls of intoxication. Imagine attending a formal banquet where the host proposes a toast to your health and prosperity. You raise your cup, offering a polite response and taking a measured sip. You know that it's important to show your appreciation for the hospitality, but you also don't want to overindulge and risk embarrassing yourself. Alcohol, like food, could be a source of both pleasure and peril in ancient China. It could bring people together, facilitate social interactions, and provide a temporary escape from the hardships of daily life. But it could also lead to excess, disorder, and even violence. As with all things in ancient China, moderation and balance were key. So you might not survive the plagues, the famines, or the political intrigues, but at least you might have a few good meals and a few good drinks along the way. And who knows, maybe that's enough to make it all worthwhile. Maybe that's enough to make you want to stick around to experience the joys and sorrows of ancient Chinese life, to be a part of its rich and complex history. And remember the stories. In a pre-literate or limited literate society, the oral tradition was paramount. Stories were entertainment, history lessons, moral guides, and social glue, all rolled into one. Imagine evenings spent around a crackling fire, listening to tales of legendary heroes, cunning tricksters, and star-crossed lovers. These weren't just diversions, they were the cultural DNA, passed down through generations. They shaped values, explained the world, and provided a shared sense of identity. Even if you were illiterate, you would be immersed in a rich tapestry of narratives that connected you to the past and to your community. You'd learn about loyalty from the stories of brave generals, filial piety from the tales of devoted children, and the consequences of greed from the legends of foolish merchants. These stories would be your education, your entertainment, and your connection to something larger than yourself. And let's not forget the potential for upward mobility, however slim. While ancient Chinese society was largely hierarchical, it wasn't entirely static. The imperial examination system, though notoriously difficult, offered a pathway for talented individuals from humble backgrounds to rise through the ranks of the bureaucracy. Imagine dedicating years of your life to studying the Confucian classics, memorizing vast amounts of text, and mastering the art of essay writing. Imagine the pressure, the competition, and the sheer amount of work required to succeed. But imagine also the reward, a prestigious position in the government, a life of comfort and influence, and the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. The examination system wasn't perfect. It was often corrupt, and success depended as much on connections and patronage as on merit. but it did offer a glimmer of hope for those who were willing to work hard and take a chance. It was a testament to the Chinese belief in the power of education and the potential for social mobility. Even if you never reach the highest levels of government, a successful examination could still open doors to opportunities that would otherwise be closed. You might become a teacher, a scribe, or a local official, providing valuable services to your community and earning a comfortable living. The examination system was a gamble, but it was a gamble that many were willing to take. It was a chance to escape poverty, to improve your social standing, and to make a name for yourself. And even if you failed, the knowledge and skills you acquired along the way would still be valuable assets. You would be a more educated, more articulate, and more informed member of society. You might even be able to use your knowledge to challenge the status quo, to advocate for reform, and to make a positive impact on the world. The possibility, however remote, of shaping your own destiny through intellect and hard work, that's a powerful incentive. And what about the simple pleasures of family life? Despite the societal pressures and the restrictive gender roles, many people in ancient China found joy and fulfillment in their families. The bonds between parents and children, husbands and wives and siblings, were often strong and enduring. Families provided a source of love, support, and companionship, offering a refuge from the harsh realities of the outside world. Imagine coming home after a long day of work, being greeted by the smiling faces of your children, and sharing a warm meal with your spouse. Imagine the comfort and security of knowing that you are loved and supported, no matter what. Imagine the joy of watching your children grow and learn, passing on your knowledge and values to the next generation. Family life wasn't always easy. There were conflicts, disagreements, and hardships, but the love and commitment that bound families together often proved to be stronger than any challenge. Families were the bedrock of ancient Chinese society, providing stability, continuity, and a sense of belonging. They were the source of our greatest joys and our greatest sorrows, and for many people, they were the reason for living. Furthermore, consider the beauty of the natural world. Ancient China was a land of stunning landscapes, from the towering mountains of the Himalayas to the fertile plains of the Yellow River. The Chinese people had a deep appreciation for nature, and they often sought to incorporate its beauty into their art, literature, and philosophy. Imagine hiking through the mountains, breathing in the fresh air, and marveling at the panoramic views. Imagine wandering through a bamboo forest, listening to the rustling of the leaves and feeling the coolness of the shade. Imagine gazing at a tranquil lake, watching the sun set over the water, and feeling a sense of peace and serenity. Nature provided a source of inspiration, wonder, and spiritual renewal. It was a reminder of the beauty and complexity of the world, and it helped to put the challenges of daily life into perspective. The Chinese people sought to live in harmony with nature, to respect its power, and to protect its resources. They believed that nature was a source of wisdom and guidance, and that by observing its patterns and rhythms, they could gain a deeper understanding of themselves and the universe. Even amidst the crowded cities and the cultivated fields, glimpses of natural beauty could be found. A carefully arranged garden, a potted bonsai tree, a painting of mountains and rivers hanging on a wall. These were reminders of the larger world, a world of vastness and wonder, a world that offered solace and inspiration. And perhaps most importantly, consider the potential for meaning and purpose. Despite the hardships and the restrictions, people in ancient China found ways to create meaningful lives for themselves. They pursued their passions, they contributed to their communities, and they strived to make a positive impact on the world. Some dedicated their lives to scholarship, seeking to understand the mysteries of the universe and to transmit their knowledge to future generations. Others devoted themselves to the arts, creating beautiful works of art that inspired and uplifted others. Still others committed themselves to public service, working to improve the lives of their fellow citizens and to create a more just and equitable society. Finding meaning and purpose in life wasn't always easy. It required self-reflection, dedication, and a willingness to overcome obstacles. But for those who were able to find it, it could be a source of great satisfaction and fulfillment. It could give them the strength to face adversity, the courage to stand up for their beliefs, and the hope to create a better future. Even in the face of death, a sense of meaning and purpose could provide comfort and solace, knowing that you had lived a meaningful life, that you had made a positive contribution to the world, could be a source of peace and acceptance. And that, in the end, is perhaps the most important thing of all. to live a life that is worthy of remembrance, a life that has touched the lives of others, a life that has made the world a little bit better. So would you survive in ancient China? The answer is still probably no. The odds are stacked against you. But maybe, just maybe, you would find something worth living for. You might find a passion to pursue, a community to belong to, a family to love, or a purpose to fulfill. And if you did, you might just be able to overcome the challenges, to endure the hardships, and to create a life that is both meaningful and fulfilling. And even if you ultimately failed, you would at least be able to say that you tried. You would be able to say that you lived your life to the fullest, that you faced your fears with courage, and that you never gave up hope. And that, in itself, is a kind of victory. Now, let's throw another wrench into the works. Let's talk about magic and the supernatural. We've been operating under the assumption that ancient China was a purely rational, secular society, but the reality is that magic, superstition, and belief in the supernatural were deeply ingrained in the culture. From emperors consulting oracles to peasants propitiating local spirits, the unseen world was a constant presence in daily life. Imagine a world where ghosts, demons, and gods are not just figments of imagination, but real and active forces. Imagine the fear and uncertainty that would arise from knowing that you are surrounded by unseen beings, some of whom may be benevolent, but others of whom may be malevolent. Imagine the pressure to appease these beings, to perform the proper rituals, and to avoid offending them in any way. The belief in magic and the supernatural permeated every aspect of life. It influenced everything from medicine and agriculture to politics and warfare. Doctors used charms and incantations to heal the sick. Farmers performed rituals to ensure a good harvest. Emperors consulted diviners to make important decisions. Generals sought the aid of spirits to win battles. The line between the natural and the supernatural was often blurred. People believed that illnesses could be caused by curses, that droughts could be caused by angry gods, and that victories could be achieved through the power of magic. Imagine being diagnosed with a serious illness and being told that it is caused by a curse. Imagine the fear and despair that would arise from knowing that your fate is in the hands of unseen forces. Imagine being forced to rely on shamans and healers who use magic and superstition to treat your illness. The belief in magic and the supernatural could be both comforting and terrifying. On the one hand, it offered a sense of control over the unknown. By performing the right rituals and appeasing the right spirits, you could protect yourself from harm and ensure good fortune. On the other hand, it could create a climate of fear and paranoia. You never knew when you might offend a spirit or fall victim to a curse, and the consequences could be dire. So how would a modern person react to this world of magic and superstition? Would you embrace it, reject it, or try to find a middle ground? Would you become a believer, a skeptic, or a pragmatist? It would likely depend on your personality, your beliefs, and your experiences. Some people might be drawn to the mystery and wonder of the supernatural, finding comfort and meaning in its rituals and beliefs. Others might be repelled by its irrationality and its potential for abuse, clinging to reason and science as a refuge from the unknown. And still others might try to find a balance between the two, acknowledging the power of belief while remaining skeptical of its more extreme manifestations. Regardless of your approach, the presence of magic and the supernatural would undoubtedly have a profound impact on your life in ancient China. It would challenge your assumptions, test your beliefs, and force you to confront the limits of your understanding, and it might just change the way you see the world forever. Let's consider some specific examples. Imagine you are walking through a forest, and you come across a small shrine dedicated to a local earth spirit. Would you stop to pay your respects, offering a small gift or a silent prayer? Or would you simply ignore the shrine, dismissing it as a relic of superstition? Your decision could have consequences. If you offend the spirit, you might experience bad luck, or even fall ill. But if you appease the spirit, you might receive its blessings and protection. Or imagine you are suffering from a persistent headache, and you consult a traditional Chinese doctor. He tells you that your headache is caused by an imbalance of yin and yang in your body, and he prescribes a herbal remedy and a series of acupuncture treatments. Would you trust his diagnosis and follow his recommendations? Or would you seek a second opinion from a Western-trained doctor, skeptical of the efficacy of traditional Chinese medicine? Your decision could affect your health and well-being. If the traditional Chinese doctor is correct, his treatment might cure your headache, but if he is wrong, it could make your condition worse. Or imagine you are caught in the middle of a political conflict and you are approached by a sorcerer who offers to use his magic to help you defeat your enemies. Would you accept his offer, knowing that it could have unforeseen consequences? Or would you reject his offer, relying on your own skills and resources to resolve the conflict? Your decision could determine the outcome of the conflict and your own fate. The presence of magic and the supernatural would create a constant tension between belief and skepticism, between tradition and modernity, between the known and the unknown. How is that? It would be a world where anything is possible, where the boundaries of reality are constantly shifting, and where the only certainty is uncertainty. And it would be a world that would challenge you to question everything you thought you knew about yourself and the universe. Now, let's add another layer of complexity: the influence of Taoism and Buddhism. While Confucianism provided the dominant ethical and political framework for ancient Chinese society, Taoism and Buddhism offered alternative spiritual paths, each with its own unique set of beliefs and practices. Taoism emphasized living in harmony with nature, cultivating inner peace, and seeking immortality through alchemy and meditation. Buddhism emphasized the impermanence of all things, the importance of compassion, and the possibility of achieving enlightenment through meditation and virtuous conduct. These two religions often coexisted and interacted with each other, influencing Chinese art, literature, philosophy, and even politics. Imagine encountering a Taoist hermit living in the mountains, seeking enlightenment through meditation and contemplation. Imagine listening to his teachings on the nature of reality, the importance of living in harmony with nature, and the path to immortality. Imagine the sense of peace and tranquility that would emanate from him, inspiring you to seek your own inner peace. Or imagine visiting a Buddhist temple, marveling at the elaborate statues of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas and listening to the chanting of the monks. Imagine the feeling of reverence and awe that would wash over you, inspiring you to cultivate compassion and to seek enlightenment. The presence of Taoism and Buddhism would offer you alternative ways of understanding the world and your place in it. They would challenge the Confucian emphasis on social hierarchy and ethical conduct, offering a more individualistic and spiritual path. They would provide a source of comfort and hope in the face of suffering and adversity, offering the possibility of transcending the limitations of the material world. And they would enrich the cultural landscape of ancient China, adding depth and complexity to its art, literature, and philosophy. So how would you navigate this spiritual landscape? Would you embrace Taoism, Buddhism, or both? Or would you remain a Confucian, skeptical of these alternative religions? The choice would be yours, but the presence of these religions would undoubtedly shape your understanding of the world and your place in it. It would challenge you to question your assumptions, to explore your spiritual beliefs, and to seek a deeper meaning in life. Let's consider some specific examples. Imagine you are feeling stressed and anxious about your daily life, and you decide to seek guidance from a Taoist priest. He teaches you a series of breathing exercises and meditation techniques designed to calm your mind and restore your inner balance. Would you practice these techniques regularly, finding relief from your stress and anxiety? Or would you dismiss them as mere superstition, relying on more conventional methods of stress management? Imagine you are suffering from a personal tragedy, such as the death of a loved one, and you seek solace in a Buddhist temple. The monks offer you comfort and support, explaining the Buddhist teachings on impermanence and reincarnation. Would you find comfort in these teachings, accepting the impermanence of life and hoping for a better rebirth? Or would you reject them as mere wishful thinking, clinging to your grief and despair? Imagine you are struggling with a difficult moral dilemma and you seek guidance from a Confucian scholar. He advises you to follow the principles of filial piety, loyalty, and righteousness, even if it means sacrificing your own personal interests. Would you follow his advice, upholding the Confucian values of social harmony and ethical conduct? Or would you reject it as being too rigid and inflexible, following your own conscience and doing what you believe is right? The presence of Taoism and Buddhism would offer you a range of perspectives on life, death, and morality. It would challenge you to think critically about your own beliefs and values, and to make informed decisions about how to live your life. And it would enrich your understanding of ancient Chinese culture, adding depth and complexity to its spiritual landscape. And finally, let's not forget the power of human connection. Despite all the hardships and challenges, the people of ancient China were still human beings, capable of love, compassion, and friendship. They formed strong bonds with their families, their communities, and their fellow travelers. They celebrated together, mourned together, and supported each other through thick and thin. Imagine forming a close friendship with a fellow scholar, sharing your thoughts, your dreams, and your fears. Imagine the intellectual stimulation, the emotional support, and the sense of camaraderie that would come from such a friendship. Imagine falling in love with someone, experiencing the joy and the passion of romantic love, and building a life together. Imagine the intimacy, the trust, and the commitment that would come from such a relationship. Imagine becoming a mentor to a young person, sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, and your experience. Imagine the satisfaction of seeing them grow and develop, knowing that you have played a role in their success. Human connection was a source of strength, resilience, and hope in ancient China. It helped people to cope with the challenges of daily life, to find meaning and purpose in their existence, and to create a sense of belonging in a sometimes harsh and unforgiving world. Even in the face of death, the love and support of family and friends could provide comfort and solace. Knowing that you are loved and remembered, that you have made a positive impact on the lives of others, could be a source of peace and acceptance. So even if you wouldn't survive in ancient China, you would still have the opportunity to experience the power of human connection. You would still have the chance to form meaningful relationships, to share your life with others, and to leave a lasting legacy. And that, in the end, is perhaps the most important thing of all. So after all this analysis, all this speculation, all this hypothetical soul searching, where do we stand? Would you survive in ancient China? The definitive answer remains, probably not. The obstacles are simply too numerous, too daunting, too deeply ingrained in the fabric of that society. But hopefully this journey through the intricacies of ancient Chinese life has given you a deeper appreciation for the challenges and triumphs of the people who live there. It's also, hopefully, given you a new perspective on your own life, a greater appreciation for the comforts and freedoms that we often take for granted, and a renewed sense of gratitude for the connections that make our lives meaningful. And maybe, just maybe, it's inspired you to learn more about this fascinating and complex civilization. Because the more we understand the past, the better equipped we are to navigate the present and shape the future. And who knows, maybe one day we'll even figure out how to time travel safely and responsibly. But until then, let's leave the surviving to the experts and the fictional characters. The real world is challenging enough. Okay, I know what you're thinking. That's it? After all that doom and gloom, you're just gonna leave us with a pat conclusion about staying curious? No, my friends. We've scratched the surface, but there's one crucial element we haven't truly wrestled with: the psychological toll. Surviving isn't just about dodging plagues and mastering calligraphy. It's about maintaining your sanity, your sense of self, in an environment that actively seeks to reshape you, to break you down and rebuild you in its own image. Imagine the culture shock, magnified 1,000-fold. It's not just different customs and languages. It's a fundamentally different way of perceiving the world, of valuing life, of understanding your place in the grand cosmic scheme. We, as modern individuals, are accustomed to a certain degree of autonomy, a certain expectation of personal freedom. We value individuality, self-expression, the right to question authority. Ancient China, particularly under certain dynasties, prized conformity, obedience, and the suppression of dissent. Imagine the constant pressure to conform, to suppress your own thoughts and feelings, to parrot the approved opinions. It would be like living in a perpetual state of political correctness, but with far more severe consequences for stepping out of line. The sheer weight of tradition would be crushing. Every aspect of your life would be governed by rules, rituals, and expectations that have been passed down for centuries. There would be little room for innovation, for experimentation, for simply being yourself. Imagine trying to explain your modern sensibilities to someone who has never encountered the concept of individual rights, of personal expression, of challenging the established order. It would be like trying to explain the internet to a caveman, and the sense of isolation would be profound. Even if you managed to learn the language and adapt to the customs, you would still be an outsider, a stranger in a strange land. You would lack the shared history, the cultural understanding, the deep-seated sense of belonging that binds people together. Imagine the loneliness of being surrounded by people who don't understand you, who don't share your values, who don't even speak your language, at least initially. It would be like being marooned on a desert island with no hope of rescue. The constant surveillance would be unnerving. In a society where social harmony was paramount, everyone was expected to keep an eye on everyone else. Gossip was rampant, and even the slightest transgression could be reported to the authorities. Imagine the paranoia of knowing that you are constantly being watched, that your every word and action is being scrutinized. It would be like living in a panopticon, where you are always aware of the possibility of being observed, even if you can't see your observers. And the lack of privacy would be suffocating. In a society where family and community were paramount, personal space was a luxury that few could afford. Homes were often crowded and cramped, with little room for solitude or reflection. Imagine never having a moment to yourself, never being able to escape the noise and the scrutiny of others. It would be like living in a fishbowl with no place to hide. The psychological impact of these factors would be immense. You might experience anxiety, depression, and a deep sense of alienation. You might lose your sense of identity, becoming a mere shadow of your former self. You might even crack under the pressure, succumbing to madness or despair. It's not just about physical survival. It's about psychological survival. It's about maintaining your mental health, your sense of self, in an environment that is actively hostile to your well-being. And that, my friends, is perhaps the greatest challenge of all. Let's delve a little deeper into this concept of losing yourself. It's not just about forgetting your name or your past. It's about the subtle erosion of your core values, your deeply held beliefs, your sense of what is right and wrong. Imagine being forced to participate in rituals that you find morally repugnant, or to endorse policies that you believe are unjust. Imagine the internal conflict, the cognitive dissonance, the slow chipping away at your conscience. The pressure to conform wouldn't just be external. It would become internalized. You would start to question your own judgment, to doubt your own sanity. You might start to believe that you are wrong, that the ancient Chinese way is the only way, that your modern values are simply misguided or irrelevant. This is the insidious power of indoctrination, the ability of a society to shape your thoughts and feelings without you even realizing it. And the lack of intellectual stimulation would be another major challenge. While ancient China had its share of brilliant thinkers and innovators, the vast majority of people had limited access to education and information. Imagine being deprived of the constant stream of news, ideas, and entertainment that we take for granted today. Imagine the boredom, the frustration, the sense of intellectual stagnation. The absence of critical thinking would be particularly stifling. In a society where tradition and authority were paramount, questioning the status quo was often discouraged or even punished. Imagine being unable to express your opinions freely, to challenge conventional wisdom, to engage in open debate. It would be like living in a mental prison, where your thoughts are confined to a narrow range of approved ideas, and the constant exposure to violence and suffering would take its toll. Ancient China was a turbulent place, marked by wars, rebellions, and natural disasters. Imagine witnessing the horrors of war firsthand, seeing the devastation and the suffering that it inflicts. Imagine being powerless to help those in need, forced to stand by and watch as people die around you. The cumulative effect of these experiences would be devastating. You might become cynical, hardened, and emotionally detached. You might lose your faith in humanity, your sense of hope for the future. You might even develop post-traumatic stress disorder, reliving the traumatic events over and over again in your mind. So, the psychological toll of surviving in ancient China would be immense. It would test your resilience, your adaptability, and your mental fortitude. It would challenge your core values, your deeply held beliefs, and your sense of self. And it might just break you in the process. This isn't to say that everyone would succumb to these psychological pressures. Some people are naturally more resilient, more adaptable, and more mentally strong than others. Some people might even find a way to thrive in ancient China, finding meaning and purpose in its challenges and its opportunities. But for most of us, the psychological toll would be simply too great to bear. We are products of our time, shaped by our modern values and sensibilities. And to be thrust into a world that is so fundamentally different would be a shock to the system, a trauma that few of us could survive. Therefore, while the physical challenges are undeniable, it's the invisible wounds, the psychological battle, that would likely be the most insurmountable for a modern mind transported to ancient China. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? Let's consider the gender dynamics, a particularly thorny issue for modern sensibilities. We touched upon it briefly, but the reality for women in ancient China, particularly during certain periods, was often one of profound subjugation and limited opportunity. Imagine being born into a society where your primary role is to be a wife and mother, where your value is determined by your ability to bear sons, and where your freedom is severely restricted. Foot binding, a practice that crippled women and confined them to the home, was a particularly brutal example of this subjugation. Imagine the physical pain and the emotional trauma of having your feet bound, knowing that it would limit your mobility and your opportunities for the rest of your life. Imagine the psychological impact of being valued primarily for your physical appearance, rather than your intelligence, your skills, or your personality. Even women from wealthy families were often subject to the control of their husbands and their in-laws. They had little say in their own lives, and they were expected to obey their husbands without question. Imagine the frustration and the resentment of being treated as a second-class citizen, denied the basic rights and freedoms that you take for granted today. And for women from poor families, life was even harder. They often had to work long hours in the fields or in the home, enduring physical hardship and economic exploitation. They had little or no access to education or healthcare, and they were often vulnerable to abuse and violence. Imagine the despair and the hopelessness of being trapped in a cycle of poverty and oppression with no way out. The gender dynamics of ancient China would be particularly challenging for modern women, who are accustomed to a greater degree of equality and autonomy. Imagine the culture shock of being transported to a society where women are treated as inferior, where their voices are silenced, and where their opportunities are severely limited. It would be a constant battle to assert your rights, to challenge the status quo, and to maintain your sense of self-worth. And it wouldn't just be women who would struggle with the gender dynamics of ancient China. Men who are accustomed to treating women as equals would also find it difficult to adapt to a society where gender roles are so rigidly defined. Imagine the discomfort of witnessing the oppression of women, knowing that you are complicit in it simply by virtue of being a man. Imagine the challenge of trying to challenge the status quo without jeopardizing your own safety and well-being. The gender dynamics of ancient China would be a minefield for modern sensibilities, a constant reminder of the inequalities and injustices of the past. Is there anything else I can help you with? It would be a challenge to navigate this complex and often oppressive social landscape, to maintain your integrity, and to avoid becoming complicit in the system. And let's not forget the lack of modern medicine. We've touched on it, but the sheer impact of this on your mental state cannot be overstated. Imagine a world without antibiotics, without vaccines, without even basic pain relief for many ailments. Imagine the constant fear of infection, the knowledge that even a minor injury could become life-threatening. Imagine watching loved ones suffer and die from diseases that are easily treatable today. The absence of modern sanitation would also contribute to the spread of disease. Imagine living in a world where sewage and garbage are dumped in the streets, where clean water is scarce, and where hygiene practices are rudimentary. Imagine the constant exposure to bacteria and viruses, the knowledge that you are always at risk of contracting a deadly illness, and the lack of mental health care would be particularly devastating. Imagine struggling with anxiety, depression, or other mental health issues, knowing that there is no one to turn to for help. Imagine the stigma and the shame associated with mental illness, the fear of being ostracized or even punished for seeking treatment. The absence of modern medicine would create a constant state of anxiety and fear. It would be a reminder of your own mortality, a constant threat to your physical and mental well-being. And it would make it even more difficult to cope with the other challenges of surviving in ancient China. So the psychological toll, compounded by restrictive gender roles and the absence of modern medicine, paints a truly bleak picture. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that anyone managed to survive and thrive in ancient China. But for a modern individual accustomed to a very different way of life, the odds of succumbing to the psychological pressures would be overwhelming. We've explored the big picture, the societal structures, the cultural norms, the environmental challenges, but it's the small things, the everyday indignities, the constant anxieties that would ultimately wear you down. It's the lack of privacy, the constant surveillance, the pressure to conform, the absence of modern medicine, and the restrictive gender roles. It's the constant battle to maintain your sanity, your sense of self, in an environment that is actively hostile to your well-being. And that, my friends, is why you probably wouldn't survive in ancient China. Not because you're weak or incapable, but because the psychological toll would simply be too great to bear. It's a sobering thought, but it's also a reminder of how fortunate we are to live in the time and place that we do. But perhaps, in understanding this, we can cultivate a greater empathy for those who lived and died in such vastly different circumstances. And perhaps we can learn from their struggles, their resilience, and their enduring humanity. Even if we wouldn't survive, Their stories can help us to live more fully, more gratefully, and more compassionately in our own world.